Recording now. And I'm going to turn it over to Colleen. Thank you all for coming. Colleen?
Thank you, Wendy. And thank you, everyone, for joining Maryland Online for this webinar today. My name is Colleen Flewelling. I am the Maryland Online Board Representative for Cecil College, and we are thrilled to have Douglas Harrison with us today to talk about academic integrity. Douglas is the Associate Dean at the Graduate School at UMUC and is chair of their Academic Integrity Work Group. He's going to be talking about the cheating economy and, as an option to that, developing a culture of academic integrity. We will be collecting your questions through the chat function here on Zoom and looking for themes so that we can get those questions to Doug at the end of his presentation. Welcome, Doug.
Thanks, Colleen, and thanks to Wendy and Julie for the invitation to join everyone today. UMUC is very proud of our involvement with Maryland Online, and I'm really grateful for the chance to talk about integrity in higher education with you today. You know, now is an interesting moment to really be engaging in this topic. It seems like every morning when I'm looking at the news, the celebrity admission scandal that's still roiling the headlines is, of course, perhaps most prominent example of corruption in higher ed at the moment right now. But as I think we'll see today, and probably all of us are aware to varying degrees, there are actually much more pervasive threats that may not be quite as high profile, but that really do impress upon us ever more daily to the threats to integrity and quality, to teaching and learning. And these threats really are growing. They're also driving a narrative about cheating in college that ultimately is undermining societal trust in the value of higher education. My overarching theme today is that we have the opportunity to use the case for integrity and quality as a driver for institutional transformation, for strengthening cultures of integrity. And the importance and the urgency of this work, I think, will really come most clearly into focus for us if we understand what those threats are. So I want to just start by talking briefly about them. The dominant risks and threats are related to the rise of what's been called the new cheating economy in higher education. And that's sort of a shorthand way of talking about really two primary kinds of corruptive activities. First is contract cheating. And really that boils down to students buying parts or all of their courses and degrees from for-hire agents. This is really a more sophisticated and much more scaled out version of what we've seen happening on the internet for some time now, where students would copy and paste from different sites. But this is a much more coordinated and systematic economy, really, of for-hire work. And then related to this is peer-to-peer cheating, where students share some or all of the course materials from their classes, and that would include exam answers and other learning demonstrations for summative assessment. And they'll share them via commercial websites that position themselves as providing study help or tutoring support. And then these materials can be accessed by other students from these websites. These two things are, these two components of the new cheating economy are really closely linked. Many of the commercial sites where students make contact with for-hire agents who might sell work to them are also often the same sites that are hosting peer-to-peer file sharing under the guise of tutoring support or study help. This really is big business. A vast network of commercial websites has made cheating a growth industry. We've tracked at least 600, a little over 600, and we know that that's probably not all of them. Revenues are estimated, I think, quite underestimated, because this is an economy that's kind of hard to peg, but in the hundreds of millions. And research suggests that as many as 31 million, or 16% roughly, of students in higher education worldwide at least admit to and self-report to engaging in some form of contract cheating. Billions of course assessments and other teaching materials are available across hundreds of sites every day. If you haven't done so before, go to one of these sites, which present themselves, as I said, as offering tutoring support and study help. Plug in your institution's name, and I think you'll see quite a few hits on your teaching and learning materials that are out there. These threats exist across institution type, academic model, delivery modality. This is not just an online problem, whether face-to-face, hybrid, blended, fully online, synchronous, asynchronous. And for the most part, higher education has largely ceded the space that the new cheating economy occupies to the purveyors of this mass market commercialized corruption. These entities have effectively established the community standards of the gig economy as the values that regulate what is and isn't permissible, over and above, frankly, the academic standards and the commitments to quality that prevail at our institutions and that higher education is built on. So if we're going to respond effectively to these threats, especially to those that are really imperiling the integrity and quality of our teaching and learning, it's really going to require the kind of collaborative approaches that Maryland Online has modeled for 20 years now. Happy anniversary to the organization, by the way. And it speaks highly of the organization for spotlighting this issue. It's also going to require us as institutions to think differently about how we're ensuring integrity in the academic enterprise, which is another way of saying that we have an opportunity here to reimagine how academic integrity can be a driver for academic quality. And to do that, I'll talk in a bit about an example from UMUC of what we're doing in this area. But first, I want to make sure that we're all starting from the same page and establish a common definitional framework. So the most widely recognized definition of academic integrity in the profession is that of the ICAI, the International Center for Academic Integrity. If you're not a member of this organization, I'd encourage your institution to join. I should disclose that I am a member of the board of the ICAI, though to be clear, I am not representing them in an official capacity today. The ICAI defines academic integrity as the commitment, even in the face of adversity, to 6 fundamental values: honesty, trust, fairness, respect, responsibility, and courage. When I talk a bit more about what UMUC is doing, I'll return to this definition to briefly address what it might mean to operationalize this across the curriculum and use it to animate organizational change around integrity. But before I do that, I also want for us to establish a baseline from where we're starting from in this work. So if you could just take a moment from your desktop or from a device, log into menti.com using that code, and let's just very briefly respond to this quick poll. And I'm sorry about the screen cutting off the edge of the prompt, but integrity comes up most commonly around which of these 3 things at my institution. And I am artificially forcing you to just choose one, and I realize that it's not that simple. But in general, around what discussions does integrity most commonly come up at your institution? I'll refrain from humming the tune to the Jeopardy countdown, but take about 15 more seconds or so. Maybe 30. We aren't quite halfway there yet. So it looks like maybe we've got roughly half. That's a pretty good response rate. So thanks for taking the poll. The first thing I'd say here is that even in this very small and unscientific sample, collectively, the responses that you see here are more or less where the critical mass of the profession is on this issue. There is widespread and authentic commitments to integrity. It's present in the curriculum. But too often, what we really talk about when we talk about academic integrity is, in fact, its opposite: academic misconduct. And in this approach, academic integrity is operationally defined, whether intentionally or not, as the absence of misconduct. How many cheaters did we catch? How many punishments do we mete out? How many academic integrity tutorials do we provision? What proctoring tools do we use? Where and how often do we place statements about what will happen if students run afoul of our academic misconduct policy? Such deficit model thinking has several risks. And one of them is that it exerts a kind of synicizing influence, if you will, on teaching and learning. My husband texted this link to me not too long ago. I think, frankly, he was tired one day of hearing me talk about the latest frustration I had encountered in some of the work we're doing here around academic integrity, because rewarding though it can be, there are the frustrations to it. I think this was his, he likes demotivators. I don't know if you're a fan of despair.com, but if you have a sense of gallows humor, that can be a place to entertain yourself for a while. So I think this was his kind of gentle, good-humored way of telling me not to take myself too seriously. But it's also a reminder that if we focus exclusively on integrity as the absence of misconduct, then the whole enterprise can inadvertently curdle into a kind of grimacing exercise in increasingly and cynical enforcement for its own sake. A related risk to this deficit model thinking, besides sort of cynicizing the culture, is that we can fall into integrity by inoculation. Usually this takes the form of an integrity tutorial that students take early on in their time with us or after they have engaged in some form of misconduct. And often it will involve a pledge of some sort that will ask the student to attest that they're going to go and cheat no more. There's certainly a place for tutorials and pledges in cultures of integrity. We have them at UMUC, we use them. And consistently doing that can have its value. But if we only emphasize associated integrity with a narrow focus on the domain skills that ensure students don't engage in misconduct, we can inadvertently reinforce this deficit model concept that integrity is something that you stop and do, usually after some form of misconduct, separate and apart from what's perceived as the more important work of teaching and learning in the disciplines. If we emphasize when we talk about integrity, if we're emphasizing that it's only mainly knowing how not to cheat, how to summarize and paraphrase well, how to cite appropriately, how to collaborate with peers appropriately, how to engage in independent analysis, all of those things are important. But if we only associate integrity with those domain skills, then we have to be open to the possibility that the extent to which we need to strengthen the cultures of integrity at our institutions, those needs are at least in part arising from gaps that are created by our own deficit model approaches to integrity and ethicality. So the question for us as a profession is, in effect, how do we infuse integrity across the curriculum, not just focus on how not to cheat or what to do when cheating does happen, but how do we infuse that integrity across the academic enterprise while also responding aggressively to this radically transformed landscape of free access to information and knowledge and the commercialized corruptive forces that we've seen in the new cheating economy. I want to talk about this in concrete terms, in terms of what UMUC has been doing along these lines. But before I do that, I just want to briefly make sure that you know a little bit about UMUC, so we'll all start from the same context in which we have been doing our work. This probably isn't new to most of you, but just for the sake of setting the level at the right place. UMUC is the open access institution for the University System of Maryland. We are a comparatively large institution and largely online, as of course friends of Maryland Online will know. About half of our students are military affiliated. We are distributed globally, both students and faculty. And about half of our students are minority students. We are the largest institution enrolling minority students in the state of Maryland, and we're very proud of that. And about 3/4 of our students are working full-time, and a majority of them are working parents. And these contexts are not just important to know in general, but actually come into play a little bit when we start talking about how our culture of integrity plays out uniquely in our institutional identity. So what have we been doing? Over the past 2 years, a little bit more than 2 years now, UMUC has undertaken a comprehensive initiative to define an institutional vision and a set of strategies to enhance and maintain a culture of integrity. And we've tried to be inclusive of all of the dimensions of integrity. So curriculum design, teaching, learning, assessment, policy, process, faculty development, support, technology, professional outreach, and I'll touch on elements of these as we go. And our effort at the broadest level really is trying to make our longstanding commitment to integrity consistently visible and effective across the academic enterprise, while at the same time championing integrity is foundational to life and work. And there were a couple of or three related drivers here for us. One was, of course, responding to the new cheating economy, and for the reasons that we've talked about. But we were very intentional not to be only reactive about this. part of what we're trying to do is move away from deficit model thinking that only talks about integrity when there are lapses in it. And so we really saw this as an opportunity at our institutional moment where we're trying to move to a new learning model based on the philosophy of competency-based and experiential learning. We really saw this as an opportunity to intentionally imagine integrity across our curriculum in this new learning model, while also giving us a strategic and comprehensive way to respond to these threats proactively rather than exclusively reactively. Because at the end of the day, for all of our institutions, integrity is essential to our quality, but especially for UMUC, which is an enrollment-driven institution, and in a competitive landscape, integrity is central to quality. Quality is central to our credibility and frankly to our brand. So we had sort of a three-phased journey that got us to where we are now, and we're now in the process of those next steps. Let me just walk you through at the high level what that looked like. What we started with was a lot of research outreach and efforts to understand where our university culture was. And that took us a long time. We tried to be very intentional and thoughtful about this, engaging faculty in multiple forums and ways, giving them an opportunity to tell us where they were in terms of the experience of integrity and misconduct in the classroom. We did a lot of research, both into the literature, but also into our culture. We partnered with our educational research unit to draft some research studies for students and faculty, so we can understand where they were. We put all of this information together and drafted a philosophy of academic integrity at UMUC, a statement that was the first part of our charge, was to really articulate a vision for the place and purpose of integrity at UMUC. What's its educationally beneficial, it's socially necessary, it's professionally valuable place in teaching and learning where we are. And we then circulated that draft. We iterated it several times with faculty, staff, students, leadership, in order to have a consensus statement, and we formally adopted that in the summer of last year. You can Google that, please do. I'm always asking our marketing colleagues to give me the hit count on that page. Philosophy of Integrity at UMUC, that'll take you right to it. You can see what we were trying to do. I'm going to talk very briefly about it at a high level, but there's a lot more to it than I'll be able to talk about meaningfully today. And then on the basis of that philosophy statement, which really became a North Star kind of guiding vision for us, we then made comprehensive recommendations in all of those areas I talked about, from teaching, learning, faculty development, policy, technology, to really become a roadmap for how we will, over the next 3 to 5 years, move forward in this work. And that was completed last fall, and we're now in the first phases of what's next. So that implementation is part of what we're currently working on, and I'm going to talk about where we are with that in a moment. But I want to start with the philosophy statement, because that's really what grounded and guided the work that we're doing, and really is the thing that we use to go back to when we have to make decisions, whether they're philosophical or pedagogical, whether they're about resources and operations. We go back to this philosophy. It's much more than this statement, but this really is the heart of it. And at the heart of what we mean by this philosophy is that if we get it right with teaching and learning with integrity, then students will be able to know and do and understand and demonstrate the skills and abilities that a reasonable person would expect them to be able to do if they have a credential from UMUC. And that in turn will give them the capacity to be self-actualizing, to be a lifelong learner, and to make meaningful contributions as professionals and citizens in life and work. And this was really important for us to articulate. We realized that we talk a lot about integrity and mean it, but we don't actually often stop and say why it matters. We kind of assume that it's obvious. And our research with our students suggested not that they don't have integrity, but that it's not obvious to them why we're emphasizing it so much in the teaching and learning environment. And I'm going to talk about some of those challenges in a moment, but those are really critical for us to articulate this vision to ourselves and to others, and to be prominent in public about that. And then on the basis of that philosophy, we built out a series of principles, 6 guiding principles that really drive our culture and our commitment to integrity. I'm going to put a lot of text on the screen here, not because I expect you to read all of it. You can spend some time asynchronously with the website where the statement is. But what I want you to see here is that we were very intentional about trying to create these principles that were comprehensive. Notice that accountability is part of it, but there's also an emphasis on resilience and building skills and making sure that we're responding with nuance and the appropriate calibration to lapses of misconduct, and that we're being proactive about educating people, even if they aren't engaged in some sort of misconduct. So these 6 principles are what drive us and align to our vision of integrity. And in turn, we were really intentional about aligning those principles to those 6 values of integrity that I mentioned earlier. These are the values of the ICAI, that definition I gave you a bit before. Again, lots of text on the screen that isn't expected for you to read. You can find this at the ICAI's website. But what we did was take those values and make sure that they overlay on our 6 principles. So here you can see our 6 principles, just a different visualization than you saw a couple of slides ago. And what you see on the outer edge are those badges which align to one of those 6 integrity values. So our effort here was to try to take that professionally recognized definition of integrity and give it very specific meaning and context for us, so that we could in turn then use it as a sort of foundation for the actions that we take in this area. So we took that vision, those principles and that philosophy, and then made comprehensive recommendations in these 4 areas. This report ran on to many dozens of pages. There were scores of recommendations, far more than we could implement at any given time, but we wanted to be comprehensive and have a roadmap that would allow us to do this in phases. So what we're driving the recommendation? The recommendations were really meant to respond to where we were as a culture around integrity and where we wanted to be. And we were really driven by some key findings and perspectives that we surfaced when we engaged in research with our faculty and students. I'm only going to deal with sort of 3 of the key related themes that came out of here, but they were really important themes that will drive some of the things you'll see us doing later on. First, faculty perspectives. Faculty really consistently reported that they view integrity as the absence of misconduct, a genuinely held belief, and it's not a criticism. But because they see integrity as the absence of misconduct, they're defining it rather narrowly. They then in turn believe that students should come to class already informed about how to have integrity. In other words, they should know how to do all those things that are narrowly associated with integrity in that more constricted view, knowing how to cite appropriately, knowing how to engage in research effectively. They believe that all of this should be things that students come to class already knowing. And they do believe that academic misconduct is a growing problem because they are on the front lines. And at UMUC, there's a perception among many faculty that technology is making it easier to cheat. And I think that tracks with what we know about the new cheating economy. We went to open educational resources at UMUC away from textbooks about 3 years ago. That's been a big transformation for us and an important way that we live out our access mission. And there is a perception among some faculty that OERs contribute to academic misconduct. We have no research that, from what we've done so far and the data and analysis we've performed, that's actually the case, but that doesn't invalidate the perception or suggest that we don't need know it's there and understand how to manage it. Students, some key perspectives from them, perhaps not surprisingly, if they're working with faculty who primarily view integrity as the absence of misconduct, students in turn view integrity as primarily knowing now how not to cheat, and they want to know the ways to avoid it. What's the education that they need to know how to not cheat? They're primarily motivated by fear of punishment, and they know that the value of integrity is important for the reputation of their degree and it's their credentials' value in the world. Our adult learners take personal responsibility for and they self-direct their own learning, and we know that. That's one of the things that make us most proud of our students, is how motivated and driven they are for their own success. And they're bringing to the classroom some values and norms that really don't always align with what we may assume to be a given in higher education. And I want to talk just briefly about 3 of those things. One of the most powerful examples of this disconnect is the difference in perceptions of faculty and students on the reuse of prior work. Faculty told us plainly and flatly, it's always already not okay to reuse your work in any way. That's self-plagiarism, and it's obviously wrong. Many students report a perception that reusing their own work from one class in another is not only wrong, but it's a matter of really exercising their right to their own intellectual property. One student said to us in the comments of the survey, you know, if I completed an assignment in Accounting 220 and then I get to Accounting 340 and I'm asked to do something the same again, why shouldn't I use that work? Now, we need to do a better job of helping students understand what could be some of the pitfalls with that. But I got to say, the student does have a point. Because if we are asking the student to do something so substantially similar that they could recycle work from a previous course, that's a curriculum challenge and a pedagogical problem that we need to be addressing on the design and delivery side. And so there's work to be done in all dimensions of this. But this reuse of prior work is really an example of a vast difference in how students, and it's not just generationally specific. This is intergenerational. We've got students, our average age is 35, but we have students, right out of college. We've got, people in their 60s and 70s. This report or survey encompasses all of them. This is intergenerational, and it's being driven, the research suggests, this is the research in the field, it's being driven by a transformation that the internet has wrought among culture and society broadly, all users of the internet. And really, Susan Bloom's work here is foundational. If you haven't encountered it, it's just really powerful here and insightful. And really, her fundamental argument is that the post-Enlightenment consensus about the autonomy and the centrality of an authentic individual as the organizing unit of free society has really been dissembled by the radical openness of the internet. The pastiche and remix and reuse, not just economy, but culture of the internet has really transformed how many people understand originality and authenticity. Bloom notes that the ideal or the myth of originality does not drive students in the age of the internet. They are more interested in sharing, belonging, resembling, converging. And in this context, plagiarism, or the violation of originality, it does not horrify them, and it doesn't cause them revulsion or despair. And so this is what's driving this gap in perceptions, where in academia, we continue to hold a set of values, quite rightly and appropriately, that assume the obviousness of some forms of using or misusing other people's ideas and intellectual property that have been eroded and transformed by how people experience information and ideas on the internet. And the new cheating economy that we talked about earlier on near the top of the hour, near the bottom of the hour, is really exacerbating and taking advantage of that gap by using students' perceptions of what is and isn't permissible in terms of using other people's ideas to drive and present things like contract cheating and inappropriate sharing of teaching materials as a form of study help and tutoring and sharing of information. So these were some of the cultural challenges and realities that we surfaced and knew that we have to respond to. And so what we're trying to do now is implement a comprehensive response. Recall that we were charged with our academic integrity work group of creating a philosophy of integrity that in turn drove recommendations for action, a roadmap for action, if you will. And so that's what we did when we completed that process last year, tried to make these recommendations responsive to this culture that we currently have, and a vision that the philosophy of integrity calls us to work toward transforming our culture to be stronger and more resilient and more supportive in a comprehensive way. So here's a somewhat perhaps over colorful slide. These are my limited PowerPoint skills. But this really is our implementation matrix. There's a lot of information here, and again, the goal isn't to try to move you through every piece of it, but rather to let you see at a high level how we're trying to manage the phased implementation of this comprehensive approach. So if you really just focus on the outer quadrant in those 4 areas, these are the areas that we're now implementing in. Even though we made recommendations in these 4 areas that you see on the right, what we found, I think, in a way that reinforced the work that we did, is that as we started implementing the recommendations, they quite purposefully and strategically overlapped. And so it wasn't easy to just say, take one recommendation from one area and another from a second area, because often there were interconnections between them. What we found is that these 4 areas, cultural change, student success, operations, and infrastructure, are really the 4 main areas that we're consistently implementing. The things you see on the screen in the chart are the things we're currently primarily focused on. We think that over the next year to 18 months, we'll start to complete some of these initial projects. They'll flow out and new priorities will move in. But we'll use this framework as how we guide the implementation. So let me just talk about each 4 of those areas very quickly, and then we'll move to some discussion. In cultural change, there's a lot going on here, but really to do cultural change in this work, we found that I think not surprisingly, a strong alliance with our faculty shared governance structure has been absolutely essential. They have been strong and powerful partners from day one, and it's really helped us. It's really helped us communicate how widely shared this commitment is and how genuinely and authentically we are committed to a collaborative process that is inclusive and is responsive to faculty, students, and all stakeholders. We have regular updates on our intranet, as well as push and pull communication across multiple channels, which has been absolutely essential, not just to push communication, but to solicit regular feedback and input, and then be clear and document how we have taken that content in and what we've done with that feedback. We try to have a regular presence at our global town hall meetings, biannual faculty meetings, videos, emails, podcasts, internal and communication, external communication, consistent and regular as we can be, so that people understand what we're doing at any given time. To do this, there's a lot going on here, as you can imagine, and a lot of it, if you're going to do genuinely meaningful change in both your culture and your operations, that's going to take some time, and there's going to be a lot of time while you're ramping this up and standing up the work that there isn't a lot of visible outward work happening to faculty on the ground. So it's important to have consistent, regular communication that makes clear that the absence of evidence isn't the evidence of absence in this particular work. And so cultural change is really primarily for us at this phase about continuous community engagement and communication. In student success, we had a lot going on, but I want to talk about a handful of things that really try to speak to some of those cultural themes that I talked about before when I was talking about cultural baselines. First, we're trying to strengthen the comprehensive orientation that we provide to our students and revamp our academic integrity tutorial so that as much as possible, we infuse academic integrity into the regular part of our comprehensive orientation to minimize the places where we have students stop and go, seem to do academic integrity as a separate thing and then go back and do other stuff. So for instance, rather than having a time management orientation and then have them go take an academic integrity tutorial that talks about time management, we're merging those two so that when they have their first experience about time management, they're also understanding how that's critical to not getting them into a place where they might be pressured to make an unwise choice. So trying to be comprehensive and intentional about how we infuse integrity into the metacognitive skill development of students. We're really rethinking our institutional philosophy of citation. I mentioned OER earlier. And one of the things that we found is that OER is a good example of putting pressure on our conventional and traditional notions of citation. Lots of students come to us because of our career relevant focus and our emphasis on working adults. And we promise them, and we really try to deliver on an experiential, scenario-based learning experience that has them doing and thinking about and solving the problems that will be the same as what they're going to see in the professions. And a lot of students come to us and say, then why do I have to use APA, or why am I using MLA for this PowerPoint? I would never do that on the job. And they're right. But we've got to be more intentional and purposeful about explaining to students the value and the importance of citation. Yes, we're trying to get you into real world learning so that you'll be ready for career success. But to do that in an educational setting, we're going to ask you to also put around those real world deliverables some frameworks like citation to learn how to consistently handle others' ideas effectively and with integrity, so that when you're in the workplace and those frameworks are removed, you still have those habits and skills ready to ensure that you're contributing authentically. We've got to do better at helping students understand that aspect of citation and how, when we say something is an open educational resource that's openly licensed, if we've creatively common licensed something, we say go out and do anything with that, right? But then we say if you're using this journal article, you need to cite that in a different way than you would cite an OER. That's confusing for students, and they rightly told us that we're not always as clear as we can be about those sorts of things. And so this is a call for us to be purposeful and intentional about this aspect of how we help students understand why we're asking them to do certain things and what the payoff in terms of integrity and authenticity will be for them in their learning and their contributions on the job. We're also trying to engage students across the life cycle of their time with us. First of all, not to assume that students know how to learn online, and not assume that they know how to learn in our learning modality. with our learning model. And so being intentional about what that means at each stage of their time with us. Too often we end up emphasizing integrity at the start of students' time with us, rather than seeing that, like any skill, it's something that has to be developed and embraced and engaged across the curriculum. And really, finally, we're trying to empower faculty as primary agents of integrity. We want them not to see integrity as something that happens only outside of their classroom, but that they are the primary drivers for it. Because when you ask students, who are your primary models for integrity, they consistently say they're faculty, and they're right. We can't do anything in our classrooms that goes right and ends up in successful student outcomes if we're not doing it with integrity. But it's often the case that we do that in ways that are enciphered within disciplinary discourses that don't always use the words explicitly that we associate with integrity, like those 6 integrity values. Now, I'm an English professor by training. When we do a close reading of a Dickinson poem in one of my courses, we might never use the words honesty, fairness, respect, responsibility, trust. But if we get a close reading of that poem right, we have to be engaging in ways that reflect those values. We have to be honest in how we read the words on the page. We have to respect the opinions of fellow students in the room when we're having a conversation. We've got to be fair when we're providing an analysis of other scholars' work and what they've said about this. We've got to have the courage of our convictions to either say that difficult thing that we think we see is going on, or to be able to say we were wrong. All of those things have to happen, but we might not ever use the words themselves. And so what we're doing now is trying to intentionally document across our curriculum, starting with new programs that we develop, where and how those six values of academic integrity are infused in our curriculum and meaningfully engaged, so that we can actually hand faculty and students a map that says, when you're doing this, you're meaningfully engaging in honesty. When you're doing this, you're meaningfully engaging in respect and fairness, so that they see that they're building these skills in and around the work that might quite intentionally need to be framed in terms of a disciplinary discourse. In operations, we are primarily centralizing how we support academic integrity by first creating a new Office of Academic Integrity and Accountability in the Chief Academic Officer's office. So this is a really important development for us. Right now, we have we have support for integrity, but it's largely around adjudicating academic misconduct. And so that's one of those examples where inadvertently, while that's a really important activity, we've unintentionally indicated that what we primarily invest in when we talk about integrity is adjudicating misconduct and the absence of integrity. And so this new office will really centralize the resources to be a subject matter expert, to work with faculty and learning designers and consult with students as needed, but also centralize our process for adjudicating misconduct. We have one policy for adjudicating misconduct, but we operationalize it differently in our academic units. And this will be an opportunity for us to centralize and consistently deliver on our policies and our processes so that they're fair and equitable and transparent to students, and that they also document and formalize our commitment to understanding that not all misconduct is the same. A first-time offense for a first-generation college student who may also have English language learning challenges, that failure to cite properly or to handle someone's material rightly because of some of those skills gaps, we need to treat that differently and remedially than we would a repeat or more egregious offense. It's not that we don't document it, but we want to make sure that our policy is clear about giving us the leverage to handle misconduct as it in the context that it exists. And so this new office will provide us guidance and support for that. We'll also be the owner of the policy and procedures that we're overhauling to be aligned to our philosophy of integrity. And it will also be the product owner for some technology tools I'm going to talk about as well. And that's really what we're doing in terms of infrastructure. Here's where we really tried to have a strategic and comprehensive response to the new cheating economy. And so we've got a suite of 5 tools or integrations that we're either developing or adopting to be comprehensive in how we identify and respond to the threats that are out there. And the first is that we're developing an automated web crawler that will go out to those 600 plus offending sites that we've identified, hoover up everything that could possibly be UMUC's material, and then use machine learning technology to teach the machine over time how to automate the selection of what is our proprietary material. Legally, we can't take down students' work, so we don't want to touch that. And philosophically, we don't want to send takedown notices for openly licensed material. We may not be thrilled that it's on one of these websites, but it's openly licensed, it should be out there. What we do want to identify are all of our proprietary assessment materials that shouldn't be out there and that are our copyrighted materials. And so the machine will be able to identify those and at scale generate legal takedown notices and automate the regular push of those notices to the offending websites on the periodic cadence that we determine. We're also acquiring behavioral biometric tools to create a digital fingerprint for students, similar to what happens in banking and finance whenever we have a kind of unique signature for our activity. And when we deviate above an established threshold, we might get a block on our card, or we might get a call from our bank saying, is this really you? We need to validate. We're going to adapt some technology of that nature to our online learning environment so that we have a fingerprint of how the student engages with us uniquely. And then when it may go above the threshold that we've identified as acceptable, we'll establish the right responses to be able to look into that further and to determine if the student, for instance, typically logs in from Maryland on Monday, Wednesdays, and Thursdays in the afternoons, and suddenly their IP address changes and the patterns that their keyboard strokes and their device interactions start being really different. We want to look into that. Maybe that's because they broke their arm and they've had to travel and stay with someone else, so they're generating different signals. Or it could be that they've hired out their work to someone who's both in a different location and sends different signals biometrically. So that tool will really help us continuously authenticate that the student is the student in the classroom. We're also fully integrating Turnitin into the classroom to make sure that all of the work that students upload to the assignment area is run through Turnitin. Right now we have a rather uneven use of it across our academic units, and we want to standardize that. Also so that we can get access to Turnitin's Feedback Studio writing tools. This really enhances both the automated feedback students can get for spelling and grammar check. It also gives rich resources for faculty to give quicker and richer feedback on students' writing before it's turned in to be summatively assessed. That's the much more meaningful way to develop students' writing and identify skills gaps and remediate them before the paper's turned in, and they might have to be involved in some sort of academic misconduct proceeding because of citation or attribution problems. For us in the online classroom, we use D2L as our LMS. Turnitin will give us a great deal more coverage by locating it in the assignment area, but we know that there are lots of other areas in the classroom where we increasingly see problems with authentication of authorship. So for instance, in discussion boards and quizzes and tests and exams. So we're developing an authorship authentication technology that will establish a digital voice print algorithmically. The discourse analysis software can generate a score uniquely for each of our writing styles, the patterns in which we use words, the lexical sets that we use, how we structure our syntax. And then we will score continuously all of the other student writing that comes in against that originality voice print, if you will. And similar to the behavioral biometric tool, it will be a departure point for us to look into any deviations that go beyond what we would expect and want to see in terms of students' regular writing improvements. And that would be deployed across the online classroom to be a kind of complement and belt and suspenders approach to Turnitin. And then finally, we're transitioning the adjudication of all of our academic misconduct proceedings to case management software, improving the efficiency and the data reporting, giving us the ability to really understand the patterns of student misconduct so that we don't just react, but can begin to see where interventions or transformations in our curriculum or instructional redesigns might give us an ability to intervene from a pedagogical and instructional way and not just be reacting to adjudications. Finally, I want to sort of show you this in a slightly different way. Here is the threat spectrum that we've laid out that the new cheating economy presents to the integrity of the teaching and learning process. So I'm not going to go through all of these. I could talk about them if you'd like later in the discussion, but really we go from the left to the right, from the most egregious. It doesn't really go most to least, but some of the worst are in the red, where we have really degrees for higher. In the center in the bluer academic misconduct columns, we have more traditional forms of academic misconduct. And then we have this peer-to-peer sharing, the violation of our copyright. These are really the threats that we've identified. And with this project, which we've called the Project to Combat Academic Corruption and Attacks Online, with this project, we hope when it is implemented in about 18 months to 2 years, that this will be the threat coverage that we'll be able to demonstrate. Now, on the far left, you see a skull and crossbones because that's a really difficult threat to solve against when a student surrenders all of their personal identifying information to a third party who sets up their student account as the only person who ever goes into the classroom and creates original content for the entire degree program. We haven't figured out how to solve for that yet. If someone does, we want to be partners in learning about it. The less bad news there is that we think that's really rare because that's really expensive, and even people who are willing to buy parts or all of their degree really are usually still reluctant to hand over things like their social security number. We haven't given up on trying to solve that, but that's one that we know is hard. Otherwise, what I hope you see here is that for most of these threats, we have multiple ways of solving for them with our comprehensive and integrated approach. We've also engaged in partnerships and outreach. This is a good example of trying to build alliances and talk to interested groups and institutions. We've done lots of presentations and workshops, webinars, consultation, collaboration with other institutions. And we're really seeking consortium partnerships to figure out how to scale out the tools and the techniques and the tactics that we're identifying that work and that other people might identify that work as well. So we're really trying to be good partners and stewards of the work that we're engaged in here. I want to transition to hearing from you all and anything you want to talk about here. But I want to leave with sort of one final thought before we go to questions, and that is to start in this work by trusting students. My experience is that discussions of the new cheating economy and the threats to integrity that we're all rightfully concerned about, it can sometimes be somewhat discouraging and maybe inadvertently drive a tendency to overgeneralize about all students on the basis of the minority of bad actors that are out there in our populations. Let me urge us all to resist that impulse, and that's a call as much that I regularly have to give to myself as to anyone else. Higher education remains one of the most powerful pathways to individual and collective transformation in our societies. The students we work with, they bring immense hope and aspiration and an authentic commitment to access the transformative impact that our institutions make possible for them. And then they take those transformations and go out into the world and multiply that transformative impact. The work to enhance and sustain these cultures of integrity directly affect the quality of teaching and learning. And that quality is a direct measure of the transformative potential of what we're doing. So I commend you all for taking the time today to make this a priority, for joining me. And I hope that we can have a rich discussion, and I really appreciate your time. Colleen, where should we go next?
Thank you so much, Doug. We do have a few people who are on the phone, and so Wendy is going to unmute them so that they can ask questions orally. If we will ask those people to please mute your phones if you are not asking a question. Everybody else, we are encouraging you to use the chat function here in Zoom, which is down at the bottom of your screen, if you have any questions you'd like to share with Doug. We do have one to get us started here, basically asking whether the idea of infusing integrity into the curriculum, whether you think this is doable at other campuses, or in particular of the community college realm, both the larger schools as well as the smaller ones. They range from like maybe 1,000 students to 30,000 students.
So absolutely is the short answer. And while the commitments and the values, I think, that underpin this work are widely shared and common, I have yet to encounter anyone who's authentically engaging in these conversations who has any desire to debate, the definition of integrity as a commitment to those 6 values we talked about. So there's some common underlying frameworks and foundation to this work, but it's going to look different, and it should look a little different precisely because of the different institutional types, the mission of the institution, how it's structured, the student populations that are core to its mission. So the 1,000-person college, and I worked at one of these, a small liberal arts school, previously in my career. That was a residential population, a tight-knit community that was really built around the embodied presence of community on campus. How you build a culture of integrity in that setting with that population of students is going to necessarily need to be unique to how that's structured. So you can engage students differently in that context than you can at UMUC, where there are almost 100,000 students enrolled and distributed across the world in an asynchronous online format. It's not that one or the other of those is superior, as we know. That's the rich diversity of higher education in North America, and there's value in that. But we have to be attuned to how those cultures are structured, and in turn what they'll be responsive to. So that's one thing. But the second thing is the reality that this takes time and investment because it's not something that happens with one and done kind of engagements. There has to be a plan. There have to be champions and evangelists for that plan and commitments to it in the faculty, in the administrative leadership, and among staff. There have to be at least some awarenesses that are given to students about it. And if there aren't existing structures and resources in your institution to do that, it will take, as it has taken at UMUC, some people like the colleagues I've been working with in this work who largely have seen it as important and so worth the service that we have put into it, but it really is something that we're doing as our service contribution to the institution. Now, we've been, I think, fortunate here that our leadership has been responsive and said, we see the need, we see the opportunity, we're going to invest some dedicated resources. So that's the Office of Academic Integrity I talked about, but that's new for us. And that will be the first time we have some institution-wide dedicated resources. So we're really excited about that, but I think it's also a good example of how there has to be a kind of startup or entrepreneurial spirit sometimes at institutions, to be honest, where a critical mass of dedicated people have to be willing to drive this, the initial phases of this work in a way that's responsive to who you are as an institution.
That makes a lot of sense. Having been as an undergraduate at an institution which had a sort of this built-in culture of an honor code, it does raise questions for me. So how was that originally developed and way back when? It's very different to be developing one now. What did it get started for that institution before? Probably forgotten in time. We have a question. Somebody is intrigued by the idea that the inclinations of present-day students themselves may be part of the problem, and they don't see anything wrong with being collaborative in academic work. I was coming up with the same question, so I'm really glad that Julie brought this up. Is the notion of scholarship then fundamentally changing?
That's a really good question. You know, I don't know if the notion of scholarship is fundamentally changing. I think it's possible. I mean, if we think of scholarship in its broadest sense, I think, of course, there's still a very large and clear consensus within higher education as a profession about what, conventional scholarship that I think we're probably all familiar with, what it looks like and it does. But I do think that going outside of that core, that established core understanding, I do think that these evolving perceptions are probably putting some pressure on some of those understandings. And here's one of the ways that I think one of the earlier slides, I sort of had it as a subheading, but I think it has to do with and this is something Bloom, I think, is driving at in her work. I think it has something to do with that what we're seeing in the sort of internet culture of remix and reuse and share and what collaboration means is a kind of cleavage opening up between originality and authenticity. I use a very sort of oversimplified example of this to make a point, and I'm going to admit that it's a little oversimple for the sake of demonstration. But maybe you don't have any of these relatives or friends, but I have relatives and friends who are always sending me something in email or via text or social media that might have a picture of a cute kitty on it, and then a clever saying, that whether it might be theirs, it might be something they've said, or it might be something someone sent to them, and they forward it along to me. And I've thought about this a lot, and beyond the fact that I know, people just like cute kitties, I think that that's saying something authentic on behalf of that person, or they wouldn't have sent it. It isn't original to them, but it is an authentic expression at some level. And I think that for me, that's been a way to kind of to explain to myself and begin to explain to others that difference that I think Bloom is arriving at, that people can collaborate with and combine other people's ideas in ways that they aren't intentionally always doing simply to violate the more conventional notions of originality, but it's because this emphasis on the radical openness, freeness, remixing, and reuse of information that the internet has introduced has really made it possible so that what we would have at one time thought of purely as fraudulent kinds of use of other people's ideas or inauthentic use of other people's ideas actually becomes an authentic expression of the individual, even though it's not their original expression. And I think that difference that Bloom is driving at is really what's putting this pressure on the notion of collaboration. And I think that Julia, I think you're right, that we should be on the lookout for that having some downstream impacts on the place and purpose of scholarship.
You talked quite a bit about getting information about where students were at the beginning of this process. What do they think about the solutions to the problem that you've come up with?
What do we think about the solutions?
Or what do the students think about those solutions?
Oh, okay. I'm sorry, I didn't quite hear it. Well, we're still in the very early stages of this. So a lot of the things like revamping our orientation is something that we're in the process of building right now, and we'll be rolling out within the next term or two. Similarly, some of the tools that we're creating to document where integrity values appear in the curriculum, those are still things that we've used, tested in a couple of new programs, and are about to start trying to scale out more broadly. So we're in the early stages of rolling these things out at scale. I will say that what we've tried to do is stay really very much in contact with our Student Advisory Council, which is a group of, I think, a couple of dozen students who provide us regular counseling, guidance, and feedback. And I will say that when we've engaged them about it, this has been something that they've been very supportive of. We hear from students who, and some of them, have been on our advisory council and others aren't, but who are very clear that when they've seen misconduct occur in their classroom, they've seen the threat that exists to everyone's, the credibility of their credential. And I think for our students particularly, for whom a credential is above averagely transformative in its impact on their lives and their families' lives, that commitment that we're placing to integrity, I think students have really seen the value in. Now, we're in the early stages of things, and that's usually the easier place to be because implementation and at scale, at scale delivery can always bring challenges. We know, for instance, that when we introduce tools to verify student identity and authenticate that the student is the student in the classroom, we know that we not only have to, but we want to be very clear and transparent to students about what we're doing. So not only are we changing our policies and updating them to make sure that they comprehend this, for us, new way of securing the data and privacy and the security of the online classroom, but we also want to present students with explanations that they will see a pop-up at regular points in their student experience with us that explains our commitment to integrity, to the quality of education, to the security of the teaching and learning environment. And because of that, we're using a range of tools to be able to ensure authenticity and the verification of student identity and protect student privacy. So we want to be clear about that messaging. And we know that there's some change management there, right? That we're going to have to be prepared for students who have questions about that and want to know more. And so that's part of the implementation work that we're doing now. So I think students, by and large, are responding positively, but we know that anytime you try to make comprehensive and strategic solutions across your enterprise, that it's going to include some questions and maybe at times discomfort that we're going to need to be prepared to respond to effectively.
We have two sort of overlapping questions which have come up. both sort of talking about this originality and authenticity distinction again. From one perspective, we have sort of like in dual enrollment courses where you have high school students and college students together. There's an encouragement to collaboratively teach the rest of their class a topic. There's also this question of the flipped classroom and how that might affect students' views about the need for authenticity. So we have that collaboration, we have that change in the pedagogy with the flipped classroom, and we also see that at least in some segments of higher education, the definition of scholarship is mutating a little bit as we see the curriculum stressing originality in a different way than it used to, even at the graduate level. So these questions about authenticity and originality sort of run the gamut from this high school level all the way into graduate school.
I absolutely do, and there's a lot we could unpack there. I think the question of active and engaged teaching and learning models, of which a flipped classroom is one example. It's not surprising to me that would be an experience or an observation that we might have, because those approaches to pedagogy have not just tried to help us rethink about how we engage with students, but it really has the active and engaged teaching and learning, the move away from exclusively direct and didactic pedagogies to models that distribute the co-construction of knowledge and skills and understanding across the classroom. That's really a redistribution of power. And the redistribution of power and opportunity is always going to disrupt value systems, including how we would understand things like authenticity and originality and what we would think of as scholarship, right? The collaborative products of this model is going to produce a much greater variety of intellectual products and learning demonstrations that will, I think, challenge in a good way, but certainly put pressure on in the ways that Julie's question, I think, was alluding to as well. How we think about scholarship. The question of the high school, I think really touches, at least in part, on how we do ethical education and integrity formation, if you will, not just for students, but because education still in Western culture is still largely where, not the only, but an important component of ethical education and some people would say moral formation, though I know that can be a loaded term in this context, because it's still an important component of how we construct citizenship and ideas of citizenship and what our contributions are. We really do have to be thinking about what those partnerships are. I will say that part of what the ICII, I think, is the International Center for Academic Integrity, has been really seeing as of late is the value of making outreach and engagement to high school local high schools that are connected to or near universities, but also to professional outreach to the K-12 system to try to think about how those partnerships play out. Because how teaching and learning happens at K-12 can be really different than the kind of teaching and learning that a student encounters in undergraduate or graduate schools. And managing that difference and that pedagogical shift has with it a set of not just skills that have to be cultivated, but also a different set of community standards and norms that have to be inculcated. And so those partnerships between high school and college students can be really valuable. We also have to give them the right support so that the collaborative and co-constructed knowledge doesn't end up inadvertently running into some kinds of misconduct that would create problems.
So moving from these, what I think are intriguing philosophical questions, we have some very practical ones as well. Talking about these authorship authentication tools that you're looking at, are these going to be homegrown by UMUC?
The authorship authentication tool is,
okay,
because we have not only, we haven't found a product that could do what we needed to do in our context as effectively as we thought we could do it ourselves. If we can find one, we would certainly be interested in exploring it. I will say that authorship authentication is probably the most technologically advanced and complicated of the things that we're doing, and will probably be the thing that takes us the longest time to build out at scale. We've proven at a very basic level that the concept can work, but there are a couple of different approaches to the underlying algorithmic structure, and I'm going to be pretty quickly out of my technological depth because I'm relying here on my the technical architects who work on the project, excuse me, to help us in this regard. But what we want to do basically is to find a way to be able to authenticate across the classroom. Now, Turnitin does have a tool that they call Author Investigate, I believe, and if someone else knows more about it than I do, please jump in and let us know. I know that they have deployed it in Australia with some universities that were caught up in some pretty high-profile pay-to-play scandals a few years ago, and that tool, they used that as a partnership opportunity, and it does something similar. It's not actually, because I won't be able to do it rightly, I'm not going to try to go into the technical differences in how the two tools are structured, but it's trying to do essentially a version of the same thing, which is to give you a way to to authenticate authorship beyond just comparing it to a database of other people's work, because we know that that's got its limitations, especially in a world where original content is being produced in a for-hire setting. So that tool is out there. I think Turnitin has indicated that they've had some challenges working with institutions because it's not just about having the resources to acquire and deploy the tool, but because it's generating a very unique form of data and a lot of it. It requires some data governance and operational impacts that institutions have needed some support in deploying. And so I think Turnitin has kind of stepped back and tried to think about how it's supporting the deployment of that tool in a slightly different way. So I think we might be seeing that rolled out in the near future. So for now, we are building the tool ourselves, but always keeping an eye on other products that might do this better or be more cost effective for us.
And what do you think UMUC's timeline is for full implementation of your program?
Yeah, that's a good question. Our project plan calls to have each of those 5 things live in production by the end of 2020. So we're about 2 quarters in to our project. That's how we measure time units in our enterprise project management world. And we are on track at the moment. These are complex and pretty sprawling projects, so I'm not gonna, though I am on the hook for them at the moment, and I'm really hopeful that we'll stay on track, and I'm really pretty assured that we will. I can't say that we won't run into some problem we didn't foresee, but right now we're on track, and we think the end of 2020 will be sort of where we want to land.
Does anybody else have any other questions?
So, Colin, if I could just jump in here, what we talked about before, while we're seeing if there are any other questions, one of the things that Julie and Wendy and I talked about when we first started talking about this idea for this webinar is not just for you all to hear from me. You've been very gracious and engaging, and I'm really grateful for that, because this is things I love to talk about, and I'm delighted for your interest. But we also wanted to use this as an opportunity for you all to help the rest of us as member organizations understand sort of where your order of interest here might be for future discussions. So I'm actually going to see if I'm out of turn here, but Wendy or Julie, would it be okay if we did that short poll now, or what do you think?
I think that would be great, because as Doug mentioned, we're hoping that this is a start of a conversation, not just a one-off webinar. We plan to do follow-up, another webinar, and kind of talk about this, because I think it's going to have impact for many years to come. And if UMUC has the resources to go ahead and do something like this, I think as a group, as Maryland Online members, we should use UMUC as a model and take what we can and make it mutually beneficial. So please, by all means, use Menti again, which is a great app. I've never used this before, but I think if we could all weigh in, and Doug, if you're okay, I'll also be happy to send it out to the folks who will be getting the recording as well.
That's fantastic. And you know, these are just 5 things that Wendy and Julie and I talked about that come up often. So there may be others. If so, I'm pretty sure Wendy and Julie would love to hear from you as ever about what those are. If there are things here that if there are things that aren't here that you would also like to talk about.
So oh, there it is. I was gonna say they overlapped. I was like, does that mean they were ties? So we still need more people to participate. If we can just this up for a couple more minutes, and again, if there are any other questions or and definitely other topics, and if anyone is having trouble with the poll or is a little bit difficult, especially for those of you on the phone who might not have access. I'm going to be sending out the link, the recording, but I can also, Doug, will I be able to just, can I grab this poll and put it separately in an email?
You know, that's a good question. Unless you and I connect offline about it. I haven't used it in that setting, but it's a pretty responsive tool. So let me look into that and we'll circle back. We'll find, I think we'll be able to find a way to make it work. Okay,
so for those of you on the phone, if you're unable to access this, or if anybody else is having issues, I'll send it out as well. Via email if we can. If not, we'll just, you know, Doug, I can always just grab the questions and I'll do a screenshot now and I can just put it in that way too, and we can add to the data.
I'd like to just make an observation, Doug and Wendy and others. What I have seen in Maryland Online board discussions is a lot of interest in student authentication tools and ways to prevent cheating by, you know, authenticating that the student is who he or she says she is. I'm very heartened to see that infusing integrity across the curriculum is equally as important in the view of some of our attendees. So I think that's some progress. I'm also interested in any comments from participants about what they expected this webinar to be about and what it turned out to be about as related to their original expectations, if there are any comments along those lines.
Yeah. Are there any other questions or comments?
This is Colleen, and I must admit I did not expect the discussion to be quite so philosophical, but that's my field, and so I really enjoyed that philosophical aspect of the discussion about changing definitions, what that means. I found that fascinating, though it was not what I expected.
Doug, any final words? No, other than that, I agree with both Julie and Colleen, though I mean, I've done several versions of these things, and it's always interesting to see where people's interests go. But I do think that it speaks to, I think it speaks to the forward thinking of this organization and the kinds of values pedagogically and instructionally that it's always championed. That, you know, that these are the priorities that people see coming out of a conversation like this. And I also enjoy the philosophical discussion, not just because I think academics just tend to enjoy them, but also in this work, I think it's really important for us to put, it's been really valuable for me, I should say, I don't want to speak for anyone else, to put a little pressure on how we've conventionally thought about things. It's not a surrender of our values as a profession, many of which go way back to the origins of higher education in our society, and that are fairly timeless and probably are not going to be transmuted by the somewhat transient effects of the internet. But it's important for us to understand why we believe the things we believe and where we have opportunities to make sure that how we're putting those into action are most meaningful in the social and the educational context we work in. So being able to have that conversation with you all, for me, has been immensely valuable and enjoyable. And again, I really appreciate Julie and Wendy's willingness to host this, to see this as a priority, and I'm really happy to be in the work with you. I'm also grateful, Colleen, for your deft moderation and support. So thank you, everyone.
Yes, thank you so much, Colleen. You did a great job. I think, especially of corralling all the questions.
Yeah, great job.
Oh, those were mine. I'm sorry. All right. Well, if we have no more comments or questions, I'm going to thank everyone. Thank you, Doug. Thank you, Colleen. Thank you to Julie Prosky-Hamlin, who instigated this whole session. Thanks to everyone, and please continue with the poll. Email me any questions, and I will send a link out to everyone who registered. So even if if you know of colleagues who were not able to attend, we'll be able to pass it along.
And we will be scheduling another webinar with Doug, so stay tuned.
You'll all be on the list. All right. Thank you, everyone. Thanks.